Hi, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the ORF Fellows Seminar. We do this once a month, and today we have two of my colleagues who have published a paper on Towards an India-US consensus on counterterrorism cooperation. This is an occasional paper that has just been published, and I think this clearly, given the nature of the subject, it clearly merits a focused discussion, and I think that's that's the objective of this today's interaction. From the subject perspective, this has remained an important leg of the one of the important partnerships of India with the United States. The US-India bilateral cooperation is a multifaceted one covering security, economic, political, and strategic nature. And counterterrorism has remained, and both the countries, both India and US, have remained victims of terrorism for couple of decades now, and both are mindful of these challenges, the magnitude of the challenge, and how we need to go about. Today's discussion, then the two authors, Kashish Parpiani, who is a research fellow at the ORF Mumbai office, and the second author, Prithvi Iyer, also with the ORF Mumbai office. They have identified this as an important area of collaboration, but they also identify certain challenges and certain differences. So both India and the US, while they do see importance of the counterterrorism cooperation, there have been differences in their approach, how they have dealt with the counterterrorism in their broader framework. And so they do identify certain bottlenecks. There are certain issues that need to be resolved in order to make the collaboration between India and the US a much more meaningful and more effective. So I think I am going to reserve my comments to the end. And we also have two excellent discussants to discuss this particular theme. We have Ambassador Meera Shankar, who will be joining us. I think she has had some technical issues with joining in for the webinar. She'll be joining us very soon. Ambassador Meera Shankar, served as India's ambassador to the US from 2009 to 2011. She served as director in the Prime Minister's office from 1985 to 1991, and in the Ministry of Commerce and Industry from 91 to 95. While serving in the Ministry of External Affairs, she headed two important divisions dealing with SAARC and India's relations with Nepal and Bhutan. Prior to 2009, she served as India's ambassador in Berlin, Germany. Second discussant, again, who doesn't need much of a introduction to these South Asia research folks, Sameer Lalwani. He's a senior fellow and director of the South Asia program at the Stimson Center, where he researches on issues of nuclear deterrence, interstate rivalry, national security decision-making, crisis behavior, and counterinsurgency. He's also a term member with the Council on Foreign Relations, a contributing editor to War on the Rocks, a non-resident fellow with the Sigur Center for East Asian Studies at George Washington University, and a 2019 National Asia Research Program Fellow. He has been an adjunct professor at George Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs, and was previously a Stanton Nuclear Security postdoctoral fellow at the RAND Corporation. So we have two impressive discussants as well to discuss these issues at great length. Someone who comes from the research background with great amount of wealth of expertise, and somebody else who comes from the diplomatic experience perspective. So without further ado, now let me hand it over to the two authors to make the presentation. I think we have about 15 minutes to do the initial author's presentation. So over to you, Kashish and Prithvi.
Prithvi, can we have the slides, please?
I just have a minute.
Okay, I think there's a problem with sharing the slides.
So,
okay.
Kashish, I'll share it.
Yeah.
Maybe you can start.
Yeah, okay. So as we load the slides, this is a paper that Prithvi and I worked on a couple of months ago, and we divided the labor on this. So that's exactly how we've divided the presentation also. So it's going to go a bit, back and forth between Prithvi and I. So kindly bear with us. Let me just begin with a is sort of an introduction to the topic. Can you have the next slide, please? So the US-India bilateral relationship, as it currently stands, it's a dynamic relationship. Bilateral goods and services trade has peaked at $142.6 billion. Over the past decade, defense trade has increased from about $1 billion to $18 billion today. The US is now the second largest arms supplier to India. And on force interoperability, Indian forces exercise more with American forces than with any other country. Nearly 2 decades ago, the situation was diametrically opposite. In 1998, the US suspended exercises on account of India's nuclear ambitions. In 2002, Ambassador Blackwell famously complained that US-India bilateral trade is as flat as a chapati. Only in 2005 did the US Congress pave way for India's first acquisition of a US-built warship. If I'm not mistaken, it was the INS Trenton, which was commissioned by the Indian Navy as the USS Trenton, sorry. It was commissioned in the Indian Navy as the INS Jalashwa. Now, behind this US shift and courtship, strategic courtship of India in the post-Cold War timeline, analysts tend to overstate the relevance of China's rise or the convergence on the values level even before the interests converge. But we think there were other factors as well. For example, the diaspora, the Indian American community by then has become an important factor in the US, not only from the standpoint of business, but also politically more active. And one other factor like this one is India and the US's common experience with the menace of terrorism. But cooperation on this front has been impeded by a certain divergence in both countries' outlooks. Over to you, Prithvi.
Yeah. Why is it? Sorry. Right. So, I mean, before Kashish really talks about the policy level actualization of US-India counterterrorism cooperation, let's really understand the notions that both countries have of their adversaries and how that really creates a sense of incompatibility in outlook. And that has posed impediments to cooperation. So we posit that the United States have always sought a fluid notion of the adversary, right? And this sense of fluidity in shaping the notion of the adversary has been underscored by a sense of American exceptionalism at its core. Now, American exceptionalism has been a regular feature in US foreign policy decision making ever since, I mean, it heightened after the Cold War when, as especially in the unipolar moment. This sense of exceptionalism has also, one of its offshoots has been their desire to be a norm revisionist, which is essentially the idea of reshaping legal normative frameworks at the international level to suit their self-interest. Two instances where we can really see this fluidity at play is the relegation of the Mujahideen from being a crucial operational ally during the Soviet war in Afghanistan to then becoming abettors of the Al-Qaeda in congruence with George W. Bush's G-Watt agenda. Now, the reason for that shift could be attributed to certain geopolitical considerations, but it also sort of is embedded in a sense of self-interest. Even more recently, we can look at the seeming betrayal of the Kurds, wherein Trump essentially allowed Erdogan a free pass into attacking the Kurds by withdrawing US forces, in spite of the fact that Kurds has been crucial to the US fight against the Islamic State. And obviously, even with the Antifa designation, which Trump sought to do, which is again trying to reconceptualize terrorists from being foreign actors to now even designating a domestic organization with really no clear chain of command as being terrorists. So clearly we see this sense of fluidity in the US understanding of the adversary that's sort of been consistent across dispensations. On the other hand, we find that India has a far more crystallized notion of the adversary owing to its regional power status. Now, two instances where we really found that regional specificity come to the fore is the structuring of the Prevention of Terrorism Act in 2002, where we found that that counterterrorism apparatus in India was given a lot of leeway in using retaliation or violent retaliation as long as it was done in good faith. But unfortunately, the good faith clause wasn't substantiated upon in the act. Even the NIA's classification of terrorism finds a whole category, for jihadist terror, but we don't find the same level of acknowledgement for right-wing terrorist groups as they come under the other category according to the NIA classification. So again, we see this crystallization that has been consistent, And I think the Kashmir militancy can truly really embody this regional specificity of India's threat perception, wherein a combination of local disenchantment within the civilian population and state-sponsored terrorism emanating from Pakistan has really restricted India's counter-terrorism concerns to organizations like the Hizbul Mujahideen, Jaish-e-Mohammed, Lashkar-e-Taiba, and so on. So that's just the the context for why there's a regional and versus global outlook divide that really underscores certain impediments to US-India counterterrorism cooperation. Slides. I'm sorry about the slides. So now, one case where the two notions of the adversary really came at odds with one another were the 26/11 attacks, and especially American ambivalence towards the sheltering of David Coleman Headley. We found that he was given a secret plea bargain. There was a restricted access to his testimony. And incidentally, he was only captured in 2009 after there were intel suggesting links with Ilyas Kashmiri and an imminent attack in Western Europe. So clearly, there was this feeling that in spite of the principal cooperation based on this idea of being shared victims of Islamist terror, we found that cooperation on the policy front was impeded by a sense of incongruence in outlook. Kashish, you want to take over?
So, okay, drawing on Prithvi's section about the difference in outlook. So on the policy level, how does this manifest? So India is mostly focused on the regional terror groups like LET, JEM, Hizbul Mujahideen, whereas the US is focused on transnational networks that pose threats to its primacy in different parts of the world, like Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab, and Jama'at Islamiyah in Southeast Asia. And of course, the global war on terror specific terror groups like Al-Qaeda, Haqqani Network, ISIL and Al-Qaeda in Iraq. What has India's position been? India's position has been that there shouldn't be a divergence in looking at these two groups and these types of groups. There is an interconnectedness between these. And three instances come to mind when in India's advocacy. Number one, 2008, Haqqani Network attack on Indian embassy in Kabul against the common effort of India and the US to prop up a strong, stable civilian dispensation in Afghanistan. Congruent aims of the Jaish-e-Mohammed and Al-Qaeda with the 2001 attack on the Indian Parliament, with the aim of keeping the Pakistani military engaged on its eastward frontier with India and not its western frontier in support of the US's war on terror effort in Afghanistan. And Bruce Riddell has a great article on this. Lastly, the Taliban's role in the LET hijacking of Air India IC-814 in 1999 is also well known. So does that mean no cooperation has happened between India and the US on this aspect? That's not entirely true. There are some instances. So in 2017, the US State Department designated HM as a foreign terrorist organization after Modi's 2017 visit. This was the first such designation of an India-focused regional group after the 2001 designation for LET and JEM. In 2018, US and India were one in grey listing Pakistan at the FATF. In 2019, of course, the American effort at the UN was instrumental in having JM leader Masood Azhar designated under the UN 1267 list. However, we think that these are piecemeal or temporospatial instances of cooperation, whereas on the policy level, there continues to be a divergence, mainly with respect to Pakistan. So our main case study here is the Trump administration's effort to break the policy inertia in Afghanistan, but and the administration sort of did that by increasing pressure on Pakistan by withholding aid. But the condition for withholding aid was also focused on the US's interests, like Pakistan's inconsistencies or inefficacy to deal with Afghani, Taliban, or the Haqqani network, and not with respect to groups that India was mostly concerned with. Over time, in exchange for Pakistani cooperation, the US even softened its pressure on Pakistan. So it released a $125 million support package for the Pakistani F-16 fleet, reinstated it under the IMET military training program, and even praised it ahead of the 2020 FATF meeting, at which it was expected that Pakistan would be blacklisted. But obviously that didn't happen. So Pakistani cooperation, and one Pakistani cooperation that we discussed that was so instrumental in making sure that this pressure sort of came down, was Pakistan's release of Mullah Abdul Ghani Baradar, who eventually was really pivotal to the US-Taliban agreement that was signed earlier this year. Moreover, under the Trump administration, there is a sense of symbolism also on US-India CT cooperation. So HM's 2017 designation was welcome, but concurrently, it was also designated under the OFAC list by the US Treasury Department, which blocks property and interest in the US. Now, the value of something like that is limited, right? And this was similar to Obama's symbolism in 2010 when the Obama administration designated Azam Chima, who was a key operational commander of the 26/11 attacks in Mumbai. And cynics suggest that the Obama administration did that before his visit to India to sort of dampen and stem the tide against the whole David Headley fiasco. Moreover, under Trump, there is also a sense of transactionalism. So, in exchange for the US's effort at the UN to designate Azhar, there were reports about the US exacting India's compliance on its maximum pressure campaign against Iran on importing oil from Iran and so on. Also, India has also practiced a degree of transactionalism here. For the case study that we talk about is the signing of the HSPD 6, which is the Homeland Security Presidential Directive 6, sorry, which would upgrade which would have upgraded the cooperation between India's MAC centers and FBI's TSE centers to have real-time information sharing. Obviously, after a few months, that was signed, but momentarily that was stalled because of the broader US-India divergence on data localization and so on. Okay, moving on, we have some recommendations. I'll do the first recommendation and we switch back to Prithvi then. So we think the current approach is mostly hinged on variables falling in place and dependent on the rising and falling relevance of Pakistan in the US's strategic calculation in the region and at large. So US-India CT must take a page from US-India defense ties, which has witnessed a considerable degree of institutionalization in the last 5-6 years. And this has mainly happened because of the US policy precedent of dehyphenating India and Pakistan, pursuing an independent policy towards India in the alternate matrix of the Indo-Pacific, or during the Obama administration, the Asia Pacific. So we sort of postulate that US-India CT cooperation must also follow the same path. And this would be, we think this would be instrumental in sort of seeking a more, over time seeking an alteration in the US's approach to Pakistan and South Asia in general, because you would have ties with the apolitical security apparatus with the US. And there is evidence that India has already begun doing so. And two examples that we discuss under this recommendation are the 2019 Yudh Abhyas exercise between the Indian and the American armies. The focus of that iteration of the exercise was counterinsurgency in urban environments, which was highly seminal. At the same time, the NIA in New Delhi also organized a counterterrorism tabletop exercise for all Quad countries. So we think these are welcome developments. We need to do more and cultivate a new consensus on CT in the alternate matrix of the Indo-Pacific. Prithvi.
So, right. Apart from sort of exploring consensus on the Indo-Pacific matrix, we also think that there is a need to really cultivate a specialized counterterrorism intel framework. Currently, the process of intelligence gathering and dissemination seems to be highly centralized in the Indian apparatus, especially with the NSA being highly overburdened. Right now, if you just look at the broad range of duties the NSA comes under the NSA's portfolio. I mean, they have to monitor 14 intelligence agencies. You have overseeing the integration of intelligence reports from state-level MACs across the board, advising the PM on complex internal security matters as intractable as the Kashmir conflict, and serving as a special interlocutor to China. So this is a really broad ambit of duties that one portfolio must fulfill. Thus, we really feel that instituting an intelligence chief modeled on the American provision for a director of national intelligence might really help reduce the burden on the NSA, and also really sort of diversify the ambit of duties and really focus on close proximity with the American DNI that will essentially enhance information sharing and dissemination between both countries. And while the DNI focuses on the sort of micro level issues pertaining to intelligence gathering and dissemination, you have a sort of specialized officer that looks at the macro perspectives that inform US-India counterterrorism cooperation. So essentially, we need a more robust institutional framework within the Indian counterterrorism apparatus that can take a leaf out of the American book, so to speak. And I think that would really sort of help making cooperation on the policy front more viable. Sorry. Right. So the key takeaways from our paper is that the CT cooperation thus far has been symbolic. I mean, we did speak about how the US and India are anchored on shared identities as victims of Islamist terror and being vibrant democracies, and thus there was a sense, especially after the Parliament attacks and 9/11 attacks sort of had a coinciding timeline, that the Islamist terror would really unify both countries. But we found that the region global outlook divide really posed impediments. So even though Islamist terror was a unifier, the nature of which Islamist organization becomes the core of each country's threat perception differs. With the US, we found it to be transnational jihadist organizations. With the Indian side, we found it to be more state-sponsored terrorist organizations. So the way forward that we postulate is, of course, continuing to explore counterterrorism cooperation in the Indo-Pacific matrix, because it does sort of align with American utilitarianism of a great power competition that is going to play out in the Indo-Pacific, dampening the rising China. And on the other hand, for India, it really allows American support against regional terror networks which are present in the East. For instance, in the Rohingya case, where the Americans have often primarily construed it as a humanitarian problem, the idea that some allegations by the political dispensation that the Rohingya crisis is having a spillover effect on increased threat from state-sponsored terrorist organizations like the Hizbul Mujahideen might be acknowledged by the US if they really do explore cooperation in the eastward Indo-Pacific matrix. So this is is a summary of our paper and what we've tried to accomplish with this topic, and we'd be happy to take any questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Kashish and Prithvi, for the author remarks. I think you raised a lot of important points. CT cooperation you still see as symbolic. I think that's interesting, but I think I'm sure the two panelists we have this evening will have some questions and comments to offer on that. At this point, I also want to let the other audience, the online audience, know that we do have a provision for question and answers, Q&A. So please provide, there's a Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. So please feel free to drop your questions there. We'll try and take as many questions as possible. I want to acknowledge Ambassador Meera Shankar joining us, and thank you, ma'am, for joining us. But let me go in the same order as given in the agenda. So let me now call upon Dr. Sameer Lalwani to give his perspective on the subject. Over to you, Sameer.
Thank you, Raji, and thank you to ORF for allowing me to join this conversation. I really have learned a lot just in the presentation, but certainly also in the paper as well. So I'll try to offer some brief remarks on what I thought were some of the strengths of the paper, but then some areas where I wouldn't quite say depart, but maybe I can offer some more nuance to at least how the U.S. thinks about CT cooperation generally and within the Indo-Pacific framework that could help sort of in future research efforts. So I think this paper has done a really good job of drawing out this point of the fluidity of the concept of terrorism, and that's a debate the United States has been having, I'd say, for over a decade now. War on terrorism was problematized pretty early on as this is a tactic or a tool based on, a set of groups that decide to employ this, oftentimes backed by states. So are we declaring a war on the tactic? Are we declaring a war on the non-state entities? Are we declaring a war on the state backers of those non-state entities that enable it? And it's challenging because, number one, state entities are more difficult to deal with, especially if they have nuclear weapons. I'm not just talking about Pakistan. I'm also talking about other great powers that might be employing non-state actors in different modes, not necessarily in terms of terrorism, but in terms of sort of cyber warfare and disinformation, things like that. And that sort of gets into very similar problems of you have asymmetric challenges backed by very robust powers. How do you counteract that? And coercion is less useful at times than maybe interdiction or resilience. So I think that's a very useful sort of problem to point out. Certainly the paper also draws out some of the problems of political differences between the US and India when it comes to, in particular, I think Pakistan and Iran. And this has sort of been a perennial problem where we see in the United States see problems in India's approach towards Iran, and similarly, New Delhi sees problems in the way the U.S. approaches Pakistan in this CT framework. And I think the paper also does a really good job of identifying some of the institutional logjams and where you can make this a more functional mode of cooperation. I thought the account of the HSPD 6 and sort of the obstructions to that linked to other issues is particularly concerning, and one, though, that I think most people would objectively look at that and say this should be removed. Just it is in mutual self-interest for us to have more direct Homeland Security dialogue and information sharing for the purposes of more resilient and better homeland defenses. So I would say, let me offer sort of 2 or 3 quick thoughts, sort of macro thoughts on this. The first is that, look, under the Indo-Pacific strategy as formulated in the National Security Strategy, National Defense Strategy over the last 2 years in the United States, counterterrorism is ultimately not a major priority. Right. This was, and in fact, it was a central argument in the NDS, the National Defense Strategy, that the U.S. was going to take risks in certain areas. That is, and that's what makes it I would argue, a pretty good document, right? It accepts you have to prioritize, and you have to accept you have trade-offs, and rarely do apex documents acknowledge that stuff. They tend to sort of want to do everything and be everything all at once, and that makes it not a good strategy. And then yes, sort of identifies and acknowledges those limits. And it the public document, which is sort of a 9-page summary, is not as useful because it doesn't sort of really go into the details of how it accepts those trade-offs. But and obviously the full document is classified. But there are definitely a lot of accounts written and discussed about it that are illuminating. So I'd say anytime you have a chance to hear Elbridge Colby, who is one of the lead writers of the NDS in podcasts or in his writings, he starts to unpack some of the logic behind it. So what are the trade-offs that go into the NDS? State versus non-state actors. The United States acknowledges we're going to take risks when it comes to non-state actors because state challenges in the world of great power competition are much more pronounced. There are regions that the United States is willing to take more risk in or accept more risk in, like the Middle East and South Asia. And this comes from an acknowledgement that there was sort of 2 decades of U.S. overcorrection, overreaction in the Middle East that perhaps atrophied other capabilities and sort of focal points of U.S. interests. And I think there's also a logic to this, which is that the U.S. is probably less exposed in some ways to terrorism. Certainly there was this moment, this crucible of experience in 9/11 that made the U.S. acutely concerned about global jihadist or Islamist terrorist organizations, and sort of precipitated a number of intelligence efforts, both in terms of better information sharing, organization, better homeland security, and I think that that sort of is really priced out a lot of the types of terrorism that could have happened pre 9/11. But then there's upper limits on. There's diminishing returns to how much you put into that effort. I think the United States acknowledged that and is starting to move away from sort of this end-all be-all CT self-licking ice cream cone, fighting them in their homeland, so we don't have to fight them in our homeland. It's become quite problematic and costly, and so that's why I think you see sort of this the change in approach to, do we fight in Syria and Iraq or in Afghanistan, or do we just sort of keep really good intel partnerships and some sort of strike platforms, but for the most part, just rely on Homeland Security to do its thing. And I think that's become part of the story. Certainly, what I would say though is that in the future, terrorism can actually become an issue in the United States, but I think it could come from a different source, which maybe problematizes this discussion a little bit. And that is, we have a very serious white nationalist militia problem in the United States. When the FBI and intelligence services started to take a look at that, it is a latent, mostly a latent threat right now, but it is one that can metastasize into something much more challenging. And if the U.S. was to approach that challenge, it would probably take a very different approach than it has with like jihadist terrorism, like overseas. It would probably have to adopt some more of a countering violent extremism approach, which is arguably softer, less kinetic, more sort of social and economically oriented. And in this case, this is, this could be sort of a path for cooperation with India as well, because I would argue that India could probably adopt sort of more of a CVE approach to some of its terrorism challenges within the country. And so that might be sort of the basis of conversation. But you're right that there's a fundamental tension between the US and India when it comes to global CT, because for India, it's the homeland, and for the United States, it's an overseas global problem, and therefore can be treated differently, but then also be bracketed off conveniently when it's useful. Let me sort of talk another sort of aspect of this paper that it draws out that I thought was particularly useful, which is sort of this idea of like the political designation of groups. So the authors are right to draw out this point. There is a mosaic of terrorism. These are networks with shared resources, people, talent pools, etc. But the United States has had a debate about this for a while. Is do we try to disaggregate the networks from the particular nodes that are threatening, or do we decide to lump them all into one giant network that we're going to go after? And I think it has been, at times we've sort of failed at this, but it has largely been, I think, smart to avoid trying to go after the broad swath of all these networks because they are deep and overlapping and frankly entrenched with state actors as well, which makes them complicated, and to try to selectively target the ones that are either most acutely threatening or most problematic to the global system, and sort of think of other routes for dealing with some of the other ones. So certainly, the paper draws out the utility of the Financial Action Task Force as a non-kinetic tool that is quite powerful and effective, denying people access to the banking system. As it's been described to me, like you get blacklisted, that is a nuclear weapon to your financial system. So it is much more powerful and graduated than actual kinetic strikes. So I think that it's understandable that this is a source of frustration and tension in the United States and India about whether we're targeting these mosaic terrorism or whether we are selectively dealing with them. I just think it's an inevitable political consequence. We have priorities. Even when in 2017, 2018, when the U.S. was really escalating pressure on Pakistan, it was clearly distinguishing between whether the Haqqani network was a priority or Lashkar-e-Taiba was a priority, and it got zeroed out of, for example, the NDAA, authorization for the Defense Department because Haqqani network was the priority. But as someone from the administration at the time told me, it was always problematic to designate the Haqqani network as a terrorist entity, but not the Taliban. They were essentially interlinked. And so again, it's a network, but we also refrained from doing that for a broader political strategy, which was we knew at some point that we were going to have some reconciliation political solution that involved the Taliban, or at least certain parts of government always sort of appreciated that. And so we sort of exercised forbearance when it came to designation of the Taliban, but it created tied knots for us when it came to the Haqqani network. Let me just say one last thing on transactionalism, because I think this gets brought up a lot in the US-India relationship. It's a taboo of transactionalism. I think that, frankly, it's become to cover a lot of things, but it fundamentally misses the point that issue linkages are a central part of all partnerships, of alignments, alliances, strategic relationships, you name it. The US doesn't do things for free, neither does India. And so transactions are a part of a stable and reciprocal relationship that are going to grow. And you can identify they can be asymmetric transactions. So you can have economic trade for security benefits and vice versa. But the idea that the US is going to sort of exercise this strategic altruism indefinitely to any of its partners actually undermines one of the assumptions, again, of the national defense strategy, which basically made this an assumption that the reason the United States needs partners is not because it's benevolent, not because it makes it feel good, but because it actually has material deficiencies and real needs for complementary partners to help supplement its own capabilities. That it had recognized that the balance of power has shifted such that the United States needs partners not for window dressing, but for material support. And so that is going to inherently require some sort of transactions that maybe should sort of be thought of in long-term reciprocal measures rather than sort of short-term one-off ones. I agree that the way that the U.S. has approached this, particularly in terms of trade, has been problematic not only with India but with all our allies. But nevertheless, there's going to be some expectations of reciprocity in various domains. If it's not going to be in commercial transactions and arms sales, it's going to be in terms of activities and access to ports and bases and island chains and things like that. So I'll just leave it at that. But I thought it was an excellent paper. I thought it starts a really useful conversation, and I look forward to seeing where you take your work further. Thank you.
Thank you, Samir. I think that was, you brought in again some very, very, very interesting points. I'm tempted to sort of add on to some of those points, but given the paucity of time, I'm going to jump to the next panelist, Ambassador Meera Shankar. Over to you. We have about 5 to 7 minutes, if that can be accommodated.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. It's been interesting to listen to the presentation. And it has clearly brought out that both India and the US have tried to forge a strategic partnership based on certain
Ma'am, you are muted.
Hello. Sorry.
Yeah. Okay.
We had a little bit of a glitch. Basically, it's been 2 factors, I think, which enabled the reshaping of the India-US relationship. One was the end of the Cold War. And the second was the opening up of the Indian economy. These are the 2 factors which I think really enabled both countries to look at their relationship afresh. Now, in recent years, you have seen that the shared challenge of handling China's rise in the Asia Pacific, as well as the shared perceptions of combating Islamic terrorism, have helped to further cement the relationship. I think the overseas Indian-American community has acted as a bridge in the process, but I don't think they have been the primary drivers of the strategic partnership. I think the changed circumstances following the collapse of the Soviet Union and the opening of the Indian economy really enable both countries to approach their relationship from a new perspective. The CT cooperation has started with, I think, a great deal of skepticism, because the US was perceived as having, aided Pakistan, helped to create the Mujahideen, and it was the, what could one call it, the flotsam and jetsam left in the region after the US withdrew from Afghanistan, which in a sense multiplied the terrorism challenges in the region. So there was quite a bit of skepticism about whether we would be able to forge, counterterrorism cooperation or not. The 9/11 in the US, which sharpened the US focus on terrorism emerging from the South Asian region, and India's own experience with terrorism, I think, provided the basis for trying to explore what we could do in this region. So we had a joint working group on counterterrorism, which was the first institutional arrangement. Then later an MOU on counterterrorism cooperation. And the focus here was more on specific capabilities to deal with terrorism. So it was on intelligence and information sharing, on capacity building, and sharing of experiences and best practices. These were the three focus areas of our CT cooperation. Subsequently, we also started a Homeland Security Dialogue. And in the Homeland Security Dialogue, we added a new dimension, and which was upgrading technical capacities also for dealing with terrorism. Yes, there has been this problem of divergent priorities with regard to terrorism. I won't say divergent perspectives, because it isn't as though India does not recognize Al-Qaeda or some of the other groups as a challenge, as a security challenge, nor is it that the US doesn't recognize the LET or the Haqqani, the Jaish-e-Mohammed as a security challenge. The question is, what priority does each side attach to which of these groups at different points of time? I think you've mentioned that the US, perception of their terrorist adversaries has been somewhat fluid and changing with changing circumstances, whereas India has been more crystallized and regional specific. But actually, even within the region, India's own, perspectives or priorities have shifted from time to time. For instance, in the 80s, it was Sikh terrorism sponsored from within the region, which was India's priority. The terrorism in Kashmir had not really become a reality at that stage. Subsequently, and even before that, if you were to look, I think it was the northeastern insurgents which were a key problem for India. So I suppose this is only natural that each country really establishes its priorities in terms of the circumstances which it faces from time to time. The US need for Pakistan at various stages, first as the frontline state against the Mujahideen, subsequently as the transit route after 9/11, as the transit route for NATO supplies, troops and equipment to Afghanistan, and now as the key country which has to deliver the Taliban to the peace process, if you will, has moderated, in a sense, the pressure that the US has been willing to put on Pakistan with regard to its activities in other sectors. But I think there are certainly clear takeaways from what we have done so far. And one is that I think the intelligence and information sharing has become better, but it could certainly improve. And there, I think both countries have a common interest, because even for the US, if by sharing intelligence in a real-time fashion, they can head off a major incident sponsored in India from overseas, it prevents the repercussions which might follow. So the US too has a stake in this, and so does India, irrespective of the groups involved. So sharing of real-time intelligence, I think, could be an area where both sides could certainly strengthen their cooperation. The second point that you mentioned, I think is good. Can we institutionalize CT cooperation as we have done the defense side, by de-hyphenating it from Pakistan to some extent? But I think from India's point of view, some degree of pressure on Pakistan from the US, particularly through the Financial Action Task Force or through the IMF or other, debt rescheduling or rollover programs, would be desirable, because that seems to be an effective tool, which is not seen so much as a political pressure point, but really as an economic pressure point which would impact very severely if a country is blacklisted. It would impact very severely that country's global ability to raise funds, to raise loans. And given Pakistan's precarious economic situation, I think it's a real pressure point that can be brought to bear. So I think we need to persist with that. Yes, counterterrorism cooperation in the Asia Pacific is something which India and the US could certainly work on. But I think that even post the withdrawal of US forces from Afghanistan, and there are question marks about that whole process, how smoothly it's going to proceed. There would be certainly interest in ensuring that Afghanistan doesn't again become kind of a hotbed of global terrorism, giving succor or shelter to Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State or other groups. So that would be a common interest point for both countries. For India, I think really building our capabilities is important, and there we can certainly work with the US. So overall, I would say, then you have the other point now that the US has downgraded terrorism as the key strategic threat that the US faces. And now they really look at state adversaries and the threats and challenges emanating from countries like China or Russia. And they see that as having priority over the CT challenges that were given priority in the past. So I'm sure that if we are cooperating in the broader Asia-Pacific region in the realm of security, then some of that is going to spill over to areas such as CT and make it more valuable for both countries. Overall, I'm not very much in agreement with your suggestion to have a director of national intelligence. I think it just creates another layer because you already have two intelligence agencies, and then you have, the National Security Advisor and the National Security Council as an apex. And now you would create another agency. I'm not sure how well and how cohesively all this would function. But there are existing mechanisms which can be used to strengthen CT cooperation. One of the issues that used to constantly emerge in sharing of real-time intelligence was the concern about leakages and compromising sources. Particularly because quite often, the intelligence goes down to the district police in India, and they are not very circumspect about reports which might have come in and so on. So I think this was an issue which used to come up because neither side would like to compromise its intelligence sources. So how do you build that discretion that would enable stronger and more immediate sharing of intelligence rather than in a more vague and general way.
Ma'am, can we just
clearly this has been a worthwhile effort and some useful suggestions for institutionalization, for cooperation in the Asia Pacific, which we should carry forward.
Thank you, Ambassador. I think both of you made a point about how whether for India and the US this has remained a priority or not, how important a priority it has been. And I think that's that one point I just want to jump in there. I think the priority is always an issue in a sense. But I think terrorism is one issue that is going to be always driven by headlines in a sense. So tomorrow, if you're going to have another major headline, a terrorist attack, this is going to come back to occupy a lot of attention and focus from the political leadership. So it's a very headline driven. The proximity to the to an event or to a major attack, given that is going to be the one major factor. So otherwise, even issues such as WMD proliferation, weapons of mass destruction, proliferation of those weapons, I think that even that those issues have always wondered whether they got the right priority or not, or whether there were other national security objectives and foreign policy objectives that overtook in a sense. So that's always a tricky issue. But I think let's go into the Q&A. Just I think we have a few questions here now. So one, I'll just read out from Pratmesh. In your conclusion, you stated that American support against regional terror networks in the East. Can you please explain why Rohingyas are an example? That is one question. Second, would it be rational for India to form a military bloc with the United States to counter the menace of cross-border terrorism and to gang up against China's growing hooliganism in the Asia-Pacific region? And let's take the third question and then come back to the panel. The question is specifically for Ambassador Shankar, but others can chip in as well. Post-November 2020, the elections, will India-US ties remain as robust and more? Will we face sermons on various issues irrespective of our concerns? So let me take it to the panelists. Samir, can I start with you? And of course, I'll give the last word to the authors for sure. Samir, do you have some comments on these?
I'll make one brief comment on the second question about this military bloc to counter cross-border terrorism, China's hooliganism. I like that. That's a fun term. Okay, so I think this is one of the points I was trying to make earlier on, that terrorism is probably the wrong term. What we're talking about is violent non-state actors, and either the threat perception of them, the utility of them, or sort of their existence or coexistence with them as sort of distinct groups. I think that if we were going to be honest with ourselves, the era of great power competition will see a return of the utility of violent non-state actors. They are asymmetric ways in which to tweak large, like strong powers with nuclear weapons. So when you want to avoid conventional engagements and try to, this is sort of, par for the course in during the Cold War. I'm not saying this is a new Cold War. What I'm saying is that the utility will start to grow, and there'll be discussions about how, the vulnerable flanks of China, of India, of Russia, and certainly the United States as well. And the conversation has already begun. And that directly challenges this narrative that CT is sort of an objective end-all, be-all. Because on the one hand, you're going to be countering terrorist organizations that are activated against you or that are abroad, while on the other hand, possibly trying to leverage some violent non-state actors for your own ends. And I think it's just a reality of statecraft that we have kind of stuck our heads in the sand on for the last 2 decades, but we'll return with a vengeance. So I'll just say that.
Can I come to Ambassador Shankar if you want to address any of these questions? You're muted.
The question of whether India should gang up with the US, I think it's perhaps putting it in a very crude fashion. But clearly, after the recent Chinese violence against our soldiers across the LAC, and their occupation of various positions beyond what they were, coming to in the past, will give India a cause to reconsider its relations with countries which can act as potential balancers to China in Asia along with India. And the US would be the preeminent country for balancing China in Asia, but not the only one. Others would be regional countries which might have similar issues with China, including Japan, Australia, Indonesia, Vietnam, and ASEAN, which has now, gathered the courage to assert the law of the sea as the primary means through which their maritime disputes in the South China Sea should be settled. So I think India will need a broad-based strategy in terms of trying to create a balance which would better help them to meet the China challenge, while recognizing the limits of it as well. So it's not that ganging up is going to solve your problems, because you would, the US itself is no longer so open as it used to be economically. And protectionist trends in the US are not just, about Trump as an individual. There are broader factors at work, and they are likely to continue even after this election, irrespective of who wins. I think even the Democrats would continue some of the protectionist policies that Trump has introduced. So there are limitations. There are also limitations about whether any other country would help you actually fight China. But you use the relationship to balance China better in Asia and to build your capabilities in a way which helps you to enhance your capacities, both technical, economic, and military. So that would be my answer. I wouldn't call it ganging up, but certainly you need to strengthen your strategic partnership.
Absolutely, very much with you on that particular point, because I think certainly India's efforts until now to steer or to find a middle ground, I think that's been always the case. India did not want to take a stand of one against the other between China and the US, but I think China's aggressive actions, and particularly the Galvan clash, has put India actually pushed India to a certain limit. Beyond a certain point, I think India is going to have to take clear sides in a sense, and India certainly needs to build up the diplomatic strategic partnerships in order to, and nobody is again talking about containing China, but we need to manage the China problem in an effective manner, so that we and I think rightly you put it out, the countries like even Indonesia and some of the major powers within ASEAN like Indonesia are also kind of sort of doing a stronger pushback on China because of the aggressive push and naval intrusions that you have seen from January onwards in the Northern Islands. So I think there is clearly a case for building up a larger strategic sort of Indo-Pacific partnerships. I think several minilaterals could come about, but I think that's a way to kind of go about. There is one, I'll come back to the authors. One last question, on the question on the US, as the US negotiates with the Taliban currently, can CT cooperation help overcome India-US divergences, especially regarding Pakistan and Afghanistan? Samir, would you want to take that particular question?
Okay, really quickly.
Yeah, thank you.
I think the objective is a drawdown in Afghanistan. I think that's shared by both political parties to some degree. The method and pacing of it probably varies, but I think there is a broad convergence that we've done what we can in Afghanistan, and we're moving out of there. And so in the near term, that means that we depend a lot on Pakistan for a sort of a stable drawdown. In the long term, if you imagine a world in which the US is sort of very limited or no longer in Afghanistan, I think at that point, it's quite plausible that our interests realign closer to India, potentially. It really depends on sort of what actors and what proxies sort of everyone's working with, and whether India sort of makes common cause with Iran and Russia in terms of backing various entities. But I think the sources of friction are much more diminished when the US has a smaller footprint or no footprint in Afghanistan.
Okay, thank you. And I think that's kind of bringing us close to this. Since we started, I think about close to 10 minutes late. We have pushed our limit to about 7:10. So let me, before I hand it over the two authors of the paper, I think I just want to touch upon one of the conclusions, our recommendation made by the Kashish and Prithvi, that is institutionalization that is required in the case of CT cooperation between India and the US. I think that's a really good recommendation, and I think that needs to happen. But if you were one were to ask the defense stakeholders on both sides, both India and the US, you will hear a lot about the frustration not making the progress that they would have liked to see, in a sense. So whether it is through DTTI and a lot of other processes have been on, but how much has been achieved in terms of technology transfer and a whole range of things are there out there. So I think the recommendation is, I think, well taken, but I think the defense side, I think there is still a long way to go in terms of where we want to be. But I think it's been a terrific paper, and of course, two panelists who offered their own expertise and thoughts on the subject. So I'm not going to take too much of time. So I leave it to you guys to conclude. Over to Kashish and Prithvi now.
Okay, I'll just end with three small points. So one of the things that we also cover in the paper is that we have a table of about 13 major developments in the US India CT domain, starting from 2000 to 2019. Ambassador Shankar obviously spoke about the statement on joint working group, which was in 2000. But the reason why we also included the Rohingya example was that although US India CT cooperation sort of began in 2000, there was a Homeland Security dialogue which was initiated in 2010, 2011. It was only in 2015 did you see a sort of convergence between America and India in terms of their respective priorities. I'll take Ambassador Shankar's suggestion on this: priorities and not perspectives. And it was in 2015, the Joint Declaration on Combating Terrorism, that was the first time it also listed India-focused organizations like the D Company. So that was the first example where you saw that there was a convergence between US and India, but that was much belated. So in talking about the Rohingya example, we are thinking of if the US and India are to explore a alternate consensus in a different matrix, there would be more convergence given the US's focus on Myanmar from the standpoint of great power competition with China and so on, and the BJP government's um, uh, statement or the push to say that LET and JEM have been infiltrating via the Rohingyas and stuff. So that has not gotten a lot of traction in the US India CT domain, but that could be one. And that is why we included it. On India bandwagoning with the US, I'm not sure if that is where the relationship is going, but certainly the relationship is going towards more institutionalization, because I think over the past 2 decades, it's been running on natural inertia. And now, without a formal trading arrangement, without a defense pact or anything, India, like I said in my introduction, has become a primary defense partner of the US in exercising in terms of defense trade and so on. Bilateral trade has touched 140 billion, which increasingly looks like the US's bilateral trade with France and South Korea, who are treaty allies. So there's going to be the need for more institutionalization, more formalization, because national inertia informing the relationship could run out. And there is evidence for that with respect to in the Trump administration signing of the COMCASA, signing the Industrial Security Annex, maybe signing BECA next on sharing of geospatial maps, instituting the 2+2 dialogue, which has been instrumental, instituting ministerial level consultation between energy department chiefs from both sides. So that's for sure. As for support for India beyond Trump, beyond 2020, if Democrats come to power, US bipartisanship on India has come under strain, especially after abrogation of 370, passage of CA, and so on. And Joe Biden is facing increasing pressures from the progressive faction of the Democratic Party to sort of cede ground to the Bernie Sanders agenda. And I don't think he's going to create concessions on the domestic aspect of Medicare and so on, but mainly he would do that on foreign policy front. And if he does so, India could become a sticking point, as evidenced in last week's comments by Joe Biden about Kashmir. That's all from me.
Okay, Prithvi?
Right. Just two really quick points. I know we're over time. First, I want to just address what Mr. Sameer said, which I thought was a really interesting point, which is the sort of renewed US-India cooperation on a very different threat perception, and the white supremacist terror domestically in the United States, right-wing terrorism in India, and that does seem like a seemingly interesting avenue of future cooperation. But then again, domestic political consideration do again pose impediments to that, especially with the current dispensations in both countries sort of expressing a certain ambivalence to that sort of terror. And I think that's an important consideration to make when we're thinking about US-India counterterrorism cooperation, is that domestic political considerations will play a role. And just one aspect of another question which I wanted to say something about was the hooliganism against in the Asia Pacific region. I think an aspect of hooliganism that we must consider is also legitimacy of the voice of a country. And as I think Joseph Nye has put in his book, is that American moral legitimacy or moral superiority, a sense of cosmopolitanism that has really shaped its foreign policy approach, has been in some sense dampened in the Trump administration. And it's also about what's the legitimacy of the voice of a country speaking about hooliganism when there are certain questions even raised domestically for both countries. So I think the idea of what's happening in Hong Kong with China, or as Kashish said, what happened with the revocation of Article 370, is that the greatest democracy in the world and the biggest democracy in the world, these ideas or these tags that have really helped construe both countries' image, both domestically and abroad, have been put under strain globally. So the idea of combating hooliganism for a third-party autocracy does stand impeded by a certain sense of questions being raised about one's own commitment to democracy, which one might want to consider when you're thinking about hooliganism and combating it. So these are just a few thoughts that I had, and I'm really thankful for all the comments on the paper, and really thank you for taking the time to go through our paper. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you to both authors and, of course, the two panelists who made, again, time for us this evening and, of course, this morning, very early in the morning for Sameer from there. Thank you. I am not going to try and do a summation of the discussions. It's been a terrific discussion, and I would just like to thank everybody for being here, and also to the audience who have joined us in great numbers and provided some of the questions and comments for the debate. Thank you very much, and have a wonderful week ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you so much.